Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for another episode here of the Amazic podcast. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazic. And if you find this conversation interesting, I want to encourage you to head over to our website, amazic.com, where we have articles posted, we have news coverage, we have event coverage, we have job listings. So a whole lot of stuff happening. So definitely head over there. Today I have with me Alex Olivier, who is the part of the founding team at Cerbos. It's an open source product so far, and most people know it as an open source product. But they've been building also a cloud platform around it now, just being launched as we speak. So a brand new startup, and we're quite excited to have Alex with us. Alex, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. How are you doing?
Hey, thank you very much for having me. I'm doing great, thanks. Nice, miserable summer day in London, as usual.
Neat. Congrats on just just the run you had with Cerbos open source, and now launching your own cloud platform around it. I think that's quite the story. Congrats on just your journey so far.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a fun couple of years solving a headache and a pain I've had to deal with over my career dozens of times now. So it's nice to finally ship a product that solves it once and for all.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I want to ask you about your career so far, and what led you to building Cerbos.
Yeah, it's a kind of a bit of a varied one. I've kind of gone through multiple different types of businesses and different sizes and different scales. I actually started at coding at about the age of 5. My dad was in tech, so I was very early learning like BASIC and on DOS and all this stuff through the years, and ended up building numerous different things in different spaces. But all through my kind of teenage years, school and university, I was always sort of developing software, mainly websites. Going through all the journey of starting with like basic frames, and then you do a bit of PHP, and then you go into maybe a bit of .NET, and then kind of go into the world of Node and JavaScript. But ultimately I ended up actually starting my professional career at Microsoft. So I worked there for a bit as a technical consultant. I was on the .NET team, dealing a lot with IIS and ASP, and kind of in a customer-facing sort of developer role, which is quite cool. We got to see some real big sort of challenges and big sort of large enterprise scale problems, of which authorization was one. I got an early view on kind of being an area of potential kind of interest and potential type area for sort of development. But then after working as one of 90,000 people at Microsoft, I then kind of switched tack and ended up at startups. So I spent years working still as a software developer and a kind of a client engineer as well, at a MarTech startup. I was there for kind of 7 or 8 years, going through developer, became tech lead, sales engineer for a bit. As you do with startups, you're going to do a bit of everything, but ultimately landed in product. So I've been in the last 6 years or so across a number of different startups now in a kind of product management function, but but for the data and the infrastructure side of these businesses. So less so about maybe the user facing UI and kind of and the kind of end user application, but a lot of time like making sure there's a solid foundation, scalable system behind the products that we were building and releasing, and making sure they could run at high throughput, low latency. And that involved me touching areas like authentication, authorization, access management, as well as analytics, data pipelines, event-driven systems, all those sort of fun things. And through all those different journeys and 4 different startups, and even back at Microsoft, one of the areas I always had to touch upon was authorization. And every time we did it, and had to do it multiple times in the space of a year in some cases, it was always a custom job. We always had to go and figure out the requirements, go and build a system ourselves, implement that. And then 6 months later, the requirements had changed in such a fundamental way, as always does when you sign a new customer, or you have a new enterprise requirement, or you want to change the packaging. We had to kind of rebuild this authorization system again. And every time I got more and more annoyed that there wasn't an off-the-shelf solution for this. So that's where I teamed up with some of my former colleagues, and we started Cerbos a couple of years ago, open sourced it about 2 years ago as well. And here we are.
Oh, really cool. Yeah, that's quite a story, and I think quite a lot of varied experience with large companies and startups. And yeah, really good that you could put it in a gist for us. So I'd like to start with just framing the key terms that we're going to be talking about. And of course, for a lot of people, including me, a lot of times, there's always a confusion between the two similarly sounding terms, authorization and authentication. And I was wondering if you could get us started with that. What's the difference between these two closely related terms?
Yeah, this is the most confusing sort of set of terms, I think, in all the technology space, which is authentication and authorization, particularly when they're shortened to like auth-ed and auth-z, or auth-c, depending if you're in the States or not, which they're typically done. The Z and the N are doing a lot of heavy lifting in both of those cases. And I really wish there were better terms for it, but hey, here we are. This stuff was defined many, many, many decades ago now, probably. The authentication is ultimately about ensuring the user or the identity that you were given is who they say they are. So we're all used to logging into, Google or GitHub or whatever, provide a credential, a username or a password, or a passkey if you're really up to date now, maybe a two-factor token, etc. But at the authentication layer, what you get back from that is a verified credential. So you know who this person is. They've provided proof of that through some sort of username, password, or some sort of single sign-on flow. So you know someone is who they are, you've authenticated who that person is. And that's kind of as far as it goes. Authorization is now, once you know who that person is, what are they actually allowed to do inside of the system? So are they allowed to comment on that thread? Are they allowed to download that asset? Are they allowed to edit that report? It's about using the context about who the user is, so that authenticated credential, in the context of your application or your service to work out whether they can do a particular action. And there's really kind of that mapping to individual permissions within inside of a system, and you'll authorize those requests based on the credential of who the user is and the particular resource they're trying to access.
Great. That's a good definition. I'd like to spend one more question kind of defining important terms that we'll be mentioning again and again here, which is within authorization. So one of the most common terms we come across when discussing authorization is RBAC.
Yes.
But there's also, beyond that, there are some other forms of access control as well. So if you can define for us RBAC and then ABAC and then any other newer forms of access control that we have today.
Yeah, everyone loves an acronym. So RBAC is the one that probably most people are familiar with. I would say definitely anyone working in like the Kubernetes world, RBAC was a whole big thing a few years ago when they got introduced to the Kubernetes standard. But RBAC is role-based access control. And this is the very kind of coarse grain level where you authenticate and then you have a role inside of a system. So you might be an admin, you might be a user, you might be a manager. And they're very kind of high-level buckets, the labels associated with you. Anyone familiar with like Active Directory or LDAP, you can kind of assign roles to users or groups to users, and that gives you those high-level roles. Then in your application, you would then make decisions based upon whether someone has a role or not, whether they can that user can do a particular action or not. And it's very kind of coarse grained. Now, the problem with role-based access control is it's binary. You either have a role or you do not. Whilst in reality, when you're building a system, you want to be able to give access to users based on context around the resource they're trying to access. And the best example of this is like you could never have a role of owner, because owner is contextual based on who you are and who the owner of the resource you're trying to access is. So if I'm trying to post an article on, say, my blog system, edit an article on blog system, I'm only allowed to edit it if I wrote it. You're now making an authorization decision not based upon my role, but based on attributes about the article in this case that I'm trying to access. And that is ABAC, or attribute-based access control, because you're now making decisions based on individual attributes of the specific instance of a resource that user is trying to access. And in that case, checking whether I am my user ID is equal to the owner ID attribute of, say, the blog article that I'm trying to edit. So RBAC, been around for ages, everyone kind of knows about it. ABAC, you probably know already, but maybe not know the term, because most authorization systems are doing these kind of conditional checks. And that's kind of the model that Cerbos is, and also making decisions based on much more contextual or relevant or specific data points about a particular resource.
And just to be clear, they can both coexist, right? You can use both at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The way I kind of typically see it and use it is you make high-level decisions based on the role. So Alex is a user, thus he should be able to go and access the blog article type, for example. And then to do specific actions, you now look at specific attributes. So now you're looking at the attribute-based access control layer. So you generally always use both together.
All right, cool. So we've been talking about authorization recently as well. Past a few episodes, there were some other companies as well in the space. And one of the interesting quotes that I'd like to mention, not exactly quote, but one of the comments that the guest mentioned is that authentication was solved a decade ago. Yes. But he said that authorization has been left behind, and it's about time authorization gets solved as well. So do you agree with this? And what's your comment when you hear this?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And there's some really interesting companies working in the authorization space, and we've all got slightly different angles of how we approach this problem. But really, we're getting to a world now where authorization is becoming so key to software. If you look kind of at the whole data security space and data privacy and data protection, you've got GDPR, you've got CCPA, you've got registrations in China, you've got legislations in Brazil, you've got more specific US regulations coming in. And ultimately, all these data protection logic and rules and frameworks that you're going to have to work in really map to authorization decisions and authorization rules. So authorization is becoming so key to any system you design or build. And so it is coming to there's been this kind of upswell over the last few years of having to come to a sensible, scalable approach to managing authorization in a system that not only solves your requirements for today, but is flexible enough to go and solve any future requirements that may come down because you want to operate in a new jurisdiction that might have different data protection laws, for example. So authorization is going through that maturity kind of now. Authentication, as you said, what was solved 10 years ago. But if we look over the history of technology now, if you go back, if you were building an application that needed to store data in a database, you would have had to go and build your own data storage and look up capability. If you wanted to store data in on disk, you'd have to manage how you read and write to disk. Authentication went through that same journey as well, where originally everyone just went and built a database that held a username and a password, or hopefully a sort and a hash, inside of a database, and then you built a lookup, and then things got a bit more standardized. Introduction of social single sign-ons as well became really a big thing. And so you have a look around, and now there's all these solutions for authentication. Auth0 and the Okta story is one that I'm sure many are familiar with. But there's many other solutions out there that solve the authentication piece in an off-the-shelf way. And it's very rare these days where you want to actually go and build your own username, password, user management type system. You just go and pick one of these off-the-shelf solutions. And authorization is going through that exact same kind of maturity curve right now, of which Cerbos is one of many solutions out there that can help you with that.
Awesome. And why do you think it's kind of lagged behind authentication, though? Is there something about authorization that makes it more complex and more difficult, that it's taken longer?
Yeah, great question. When you think of authentication, it's a one-off action generally. So you challenge your user, they need to present a credential, username, password, login with Google, etc., and you get back a response that says yes or no. This person is who they are, or they're not. And that's something that you can do once, or maybe once every 30 minutes or every 30 days, and you have kind of a session token, and that token kind of hangs around, and it's kind of a binary operation. Authorization is much more complex, not just from a technical standpoint, but actually from a business sort of understanding perspective. One of the challenges we see with users that go and implement Cerbos, and we've had big enterprise companies like FTSE 250, like a utility warehouse, we've had Envoy, we've had blockchain.com, etc., and go and implement Cerbos. And the biggest kind of challenges they went through was actually getting their teams and all the relevant stakeholders inside of the business to actually align and agree on actually what the permissioning rules should be. Because unlike authentication, which is just binary, yes, you're authenticated or you're not, authorization now needs to take in lots of different assets and facets of decision making. And your customer support team might want to have particular actions. Your product team need to lock down things a certain way. Your sales team might want to slice up access based on packages. Your in-house counsel or your security team will have a load of requirements that maybe come from like a SOC 2 or an ISO audit that they need to put in place. So actually, the biggest challenge is just agreeing on that process. And we actually tell users when we go and have these we do calls with hundreds of users at this point, and we just say, like, go and sit down with the relevant people in your company, get that spreadsheet up, and come up with that matrix, that grid of role and permissions, and find the ones that are just yes, no, and also find the ones that are conditional. So going back to my owner example earlier, you should only be able to edit an article if you own it. It's not a yes or a no in a box in a grid. It's now a question mark because it's going to be conditional. And getting really everyone aligned around what the business logic should be is the bulk of the work. Translating that into Cerbos policy is pretty trivial, and we provide lots of tooling around it. So the biggest hurdle really to overcome when implementing authorization is just get everyone to agree on what the rules should be and kind of codifying it. And that's where Cerbos kind of helps you with that process and gives you lots of nice tooling to make sure you're covering all the edge cases as well, because you're never going to catch everything just in a spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. So I want to dig in a bit about talking about authorization from the point of view of the company that's implementing it. You mentioned the different roles when it comes to authorization, but even within a company, there's different stakeholders, different, we're talking about platform engineering and, separating dev from the platform team. And then there's the SRE team and different teams that are there. If you can talk a bit about what does authorization look like in when it comes to implementation and the challenges around it, and even give us some perspective of how are the challenges different for a startup versus an enterprise, and what are some of the different levels of challenges that an organization could go through when dealing with authorization? How could they maybe start simple and then realize that, hey, this is growing faster than us? Some context around that. What does authorization look like in companies?
Yeah, so when you're starting out, you want to get up and running. You want to get to an MVP as fast as possible. And you might just start off by having a very simple rule, hard-coded across your application code base that says, if the user's email contains our company domain, then they should be able to do everything because they're an admin. And it's a very simple if statement to go and put inside of your request handlers, and kind of off you go. Then you might kind of start maturing a bit, and now you actually want to be able to have different roles beyond that. So it's no longer a binary admin or user. You might want to have managers, or you might want to have customers, you might want to have subscribers. So now you have to go and touch every part of your code base that was doing those permission checks before, and now kind of extend that if-else statement or a case switch statement to cater for these new kind of roles. So you might now have logic that says, if their email address ends in our company domain, they should be able to do the action. Or if they have a role of manager, they should be able to do the action. So now you're adding more conditions. And then you kind of start maturing a bit further, and that's say you're now at the point where you're starting to sell, say, a SaaS platform. You have a sales team. That sales team kind of comes around and says, hey, we've got this big deal on the line, but they need to have different permissions for their business inside of the system because they don't fit into the 3 that we prescribe. So now you have to go back to your code and start updating all that logic again for further checks. And maybe you have this concept of groups that you now want to introduce. Again, it's more logical checks that you're going to touch in every part of your code, test that code, run it through QA, release it, etc. And it's an iteration cycle back with your developers. You keep scaling up again, and now maybe you want to start selling into different regions of the world. So I mentioned like GDPR, CCPA, and all these other kind of frameworks that you're now going to have to adhere in if you want to sell in different parts of the world. You now have to bake those checks into your application as well. So working out whether a user is in an EU office, they should only be able to access data in the EU, or if they're in the US office, they should be able to access data in the US. This is another type of authorization check that you're kind of obliged to adhere to under these kind of regulations. And then you keep going, you're now more successful, and then you start going for things like your certifications. So you want to ease the onboarding for larger customers. So you go for ISO, you go for SOC 2, and you go through all those processes, and there's a lot of kind of business processes put in place, but there's also technical requirements. You have to be able to have strong access controls inside of your system. And it's not good enough just saying, yeah, we do. You need to actually be able to demonstrate that. Now, I went through an ISO audit numerous times at a previous company, and every year I would get dragged down to a conference room in the basement somewhere by an auditor where I had to be able to demonstrate our audit log capabilities. And at the time, we didn't really have any because we were moving fast, we were a startup, etc. So I was there trying to like grep through logs in S3, etc., trying to demonstrate how we either denied or granted access, etc. And kind of it was possible, but it wasn't a great experience. So when you reach that stage, you want to make sure you have a very good audit story around not just the changes of the authorization policies themselves, but also how you capture the decisions that the authorization system makes inside of it. So you can then demonstrate to the relevant people that you have controls in place. And also if there was, God forbid, a breach at some point, you actually now have the logs as well to go and figure out who did what and how it occurred. So that's kind of the next phase. And then when you start getting into some point in that journey, you might start getting to a point where you need to move maybe to a microservices architecture. Now there's actually a technical reason why you need to kind of rethink authorization, because now it can't be hard coded inside your application logic, because now your application logic is split across 5 different services, and those 5 different services might be in different languages. So every time the requirements change to authorization, you now need to go and touch 5 code bases in maybe 5 different languages, and translate the business requirements into JavaScript and Python and .NET and Java and XYZ other language that you might be using. And so as you go along this kind of maturity curve as a company, the authorization requirements get more and more complex and more challenging. There's an operational overhead. The complexity increases every time the requirements change. You're going to have to go back to your dev team who already have a whole roadmap that they're working through, and they'll be like, take a ticket, I'll look at it in 3 months' time, which isn't going to kind of work if it's maybe blocking a sale, or you're potentially on the brink of having a breach, or you're going through an audit process, etc. So authorization touches every part of the application and also every part of the business, whether you know it kind of or not. And as you kind of mature, it's going to hit you harder and harder every time.
Yeah, sounds like, we're moving from where it was a fixed thing that you built once in a year or once in a few months and you revisit it, to now it needs to be really flexible. It's dynamic, it's changing all the time, and you need the ability to change accordingly. And yeah, I think that's quite a challenge. But another challenge that comes to my mind when we talk about this is, on one side, there's, you're trying to balance enabling things to happen, enabling developers to build stuff, users to access stuff. And then on the other side, that's your user experience. On the other side, you want to also make sure that security is not compromised. And so I think this can become quite tricky, especially as you mentioned, when things become more complex and your needs are more advanced. Could you talk a bit on that, this balance between enabling versus securing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first kind of line in the sand we drew when designing Cerbos, and when we think about systems more generally, is making sure that there's always a strong story around testing and deployments. Myself and the kind of the rest of our team, we all come from mainly software backgrounds, building very high throughput, low latency, secure systems at very large scales, talking millions of requests a second type levels. And there's certain philosophies that kind of just make sense from a software development point of view. One of them obviously is testing, and the second one is around the audit story in terms of how you roll out and manage changes. We're all used to blue-green deployment, staging environments, those kind of things. And we've taken that same mindset and we're applying it to authorization. So when it comes to kind of the user experience of managing policy, the person that best knows the requirements for authorization isn't the developer that's got the Jira ticket to say, go and update the logic to do this. It's actually going to be the product owner, or it's going to be the security team, or some other kind of persona in the business that actually really holds the requirements for authorization. And that user is probably not going to have their head in the code base day in, day out. So the way we think is kind of scalably do this in a way that's best for everyone involved is by extracting that business logic out of the application code and putting it into policy. So the way Cerbos works is you have policy which define the different resource types in your system, the different actions users can do within that system, and under which conditions. So what that now means is a level playing field where anyone in the business really can now look at policy, and we've have cases of this where a product manager who maybe isn't fluent in Go or Java or whatever the application code is can now actually rationalize and really understand how the authorization logic works, because it's no longer hard coded. It's now in a very kind of, we think at least, a very kind of easy, understandable policy based format. And then from the security standpoint, if you were to start evolving and changing these policies, how do you know that a change doesn't break everything? Well, you can take a software-led approach to this and actually write tests. So with Cerbos, you can define example principles and resources for your system and then write test cases for it. So now, whenever a rule needs to change, you can run CI against it, and Cerbos will let you know, hey, this particular condition, this project logic now changes, this breaks things. At that point, you can either decide to go on with the change or make some improvements, etc. And then this is all backed by where you store your policies. And Cerbos, we take a Git GitOps based approach, which for those that aren't familiar, GitOps is essentially storing the state of your system in a Git repo. And then you make any changes to your typically infrastructure, but in this case, your authorization policy as commits to that repo. And then your infrastructure picks up those changes from that repository. And what that now means is you also have a very clean change history. All the benefits and all the tooling, we've all got that muscle memory now about working with Git repositories and all the advantages of seeing pull requests and those sort of things. You will use that exact same workflow and that same discipline when it comes to managing authorization logic as well. So extracting out the code base allows you to get more eyes on authorization logic in a way that doesn't require you to know some programming language, for example. And then having all the tooling around tests, running CI, managing the audit, change history, change control management, those kind of things, are kind of bring in that security and that kind of confidence of a change before it goes anywhere near a production environment.
Mm-hmm. All right. And so, you piqued our interest about Cerbos and what it does. You're talking about how it removes authorization from the application itself and its policy-based GitOps approach. If you could walk us through Cerbos and the architecture behind it, how it works. I'd love to see that, and even maybe give us a glimpse of the dashboard. I'd love to see Cerbos itself.
Absolutely. So the best way, and I'll just share my screen here, of kind of demonstrating it is through a single diagram. We're not one to go and pull up a whole slide deck and I hate presenting 60 slides about blah 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 blah. The way we actually talk about Cerbos is use this single diagram, which hopefully you see on your screen now. Yeah. So this is a kind of a typical application. If we look across our user base today, we see a scenario where they have users, they're authenticating using something like Auth0 or Firebase Authentication or Fusion Auth or one of these kind of various IDPs. And they're making requests to an app. That app is going to have some sort of usual web front ends, maybe it's React or whatever. Doesn't really matter to Cerbos. And then there's a backend, and that backend could be a monolith, it could be a web of microservices, etc. Again, it's kind of agnostic to Cerbos. So what that kind of that workflow or that data flow looks like is you have your end users, they make a request to your application. And the first thing that application does is it validates that user session. So it goes off to Auth0 or checks whether the JWT is valid, or it goes and checks against some other authentication type logic. That authentication system then comes back with the user's profile. So maybe name, email address, ID. It will potentially contain roles. So this person is a user, this person is an admin, those kind of high level, very coarse grained roles. You might have a directory system as well. So if you're maybe in the Microsoft world, you might have an Active Directory instance. You might have an LDAP, which gives you kind of group and role, group memberships and those kind of things. That's all context about their user, their identity, and their role. And you now know who this user is that's making the request and maybe further attributes about them. The other thing you know based on that request is what resource inside of your system that user is trying to access. Say it's typical, you got like a REST API, they're trying to do a patch request or editor resource inside your system. You know the resource ID, say from the URL, the actual resource. So you can go and fetch from your database that particular record, and then you now know the principal, you know the resource. And also based on the request, on the action they're trying to do. Are they trying to edit, delete, update, create, etc. So the typical way of doing things is you would then look at the information about the user, the information about the resource, and then you would have had that if-else case switch style statement sort of hard-coded in your application here. And that would be across every request handler in every service where you're trying to have a user interact with your system. That's, as I was saying at the start, is fine for a very small application, but as things scale up or as the requirements get more complex, that things start to break down a bit, and it's going to be very complicated to go and update this logic. So the Cerbos approach extracts all that business logic out into a standalone service. So Cerbos is distributed as a container, and we also have binaries, etc., which you run alongside your application. So this is running inside your environment, inside your VPC, inside your network, depending however you deploy your application. If you're running in Kubernetes, we really recommend the sidecar approach. And this Cerbos instance takes in a request from your application saying, I have this principal with these attributes, trying to do this action on this resource with these particular attributes. That Cerbos instance then has in it, has loaded into it the policy that are currently defined for your application. And so those policies could be coming from a Git repo for like a nice GitOps workflow. They could be coming from a disk or cloud storage. It can even be coming from a database. And Cerbos Cloud is a new capability we're adding at the moment. But that Cerbos instance basically makes a judgment based on those policies and those inputs of principal, resource, and action. And Cerbos itself is stateless. So it doesn't have to go and do any data fetching. It doesn't have to go and look up anywhere. It doesn't have to go and write to disk or anything like that. It's doing all this decisioning in memory. So there's no requirement to synchronize state or anything like this. So it's a super fast response. And so Cerbos evaluates the policies, and simply returns back to your application either an allow or deny decision. What that means now in your application is rather than having that big if-else case switch style logic, it's now a single if statement. If Cerbos response is allow, do the thing. If not, return some sort of error. Now, this architecture is, because of its statelessness, is kind of infinitely scalable. You can run one Cerbos instance per request even. We have users that do that in like Lambda. Because there is none of that requirement to maintain state or synchronize thing, there's no external API call over the internet. The last thing you want to do is have your authorization system have to go and hit the internet on every request, because authorization is in the blocking path of every single call to your application. Authentication, you can do once and cache for 30 minutes in a token. Authorization has to be in the blocking path for every request. So if you're going to hit the internet and go back every time, you're looking at 10, 15, 20, 30 milliseconds every single time where that request is just going to be pending and hanging. And, at the bottom line, that's going to come down to how much you're paying for your infrastructure, because that CPU time is going to be used up whilst it's waiting for that response. Cerbos is all local inside your environment. You can even run it in an air-gapped environment, of which we have users that do this. So it's super, super fast response. Now, the benefit of this model is, one, we've extracted all that business logic out into policy. And what that now means is you can evolve and change your authorization logic and policy. So those policy definition files in your Git repo, for example, you can evolve and change those independently of your application. So when a new requirement comes in, you want to grant an extra permission to a role, there's one place to update it. And now you push that out, the Cerbos instances will pull down that update. And now everywhere in your application where that permission check has been done, it's now going to be updated and serving based on that new logic. So this is great for being able to evolve and change things kind of at scale and being quite responsive to the needs and requirements that maybe you're getting from users or customers, without having to go back to your dev team to get that logic changed and go and touch many parts of the code base. So that's a big win. There's also a secondary sort of side benefit to this, which is because now all the authorization decisions are going to be going through a central kind of service inside of your architecture, every decision is going to be captured and logged by the Cerbos instance. So regardless of where you're doing permission checks, front end, back end, some async job, some worker queue somewhere, because all the checks are going through a Cerbos instance, you're going to get a clean and consistent audit log out to your infrastructure. At this time, this principal tried to do this action on this resource, and it was either allowed or denied by X policy, which is a godsend for that environment I was talking about earlier, where you have to go and prove your audit logs and access control across the user base that we know about Cerbos. Obviously, it's open source. We don't know who everyone is. But the ones that we've actually had conversations with, we have a large portion that are in regulated industries. So we have a lot of fintech and banking, insurance and finance type users, because they have this very hard requirement around access controls and audit logging, particularly of those controls. So it's kind of a side benefit you essentially get for free by using this decoupled approach to authorization that, again, is all local. There's no cloud dependency or anything like this to make a decision upon. So it's extremely performant, runs inside your infrastructure, allows you to modify and evolve policy independently of your application code, and gives you that very strong audit log.
Wow. Yeah, it's really cool. Sounds like it would really make life easy, especially for developers, just because it's simpler now for them. They have fewer things to do when it comes to authorization. What are some of the remarks you've heard from developers or even from the ops team, people managing authorization once they start using Cerbos? What are some of the things they say?
The thing we hear the most is it just works, which I don't want to steal from Apple and everything like that. But what we generally see is Cerbos is implemented once and they don't really have to think about it again. Because of the architecture we've designed, this kind of decoupled, scalable, stateless approach, once you deploy Cerbos and done that one-off work inside of your application to call the Cerbos instance, you don't really have to think about it again. Particularly the operations or the engineers or the developer team, they just hand off the policy management back to the product team or the product owner or the security, whoever needs to inside the business to manage policy. Unless there's a new attribute that needs to be checked, there's no need to kind of get involved. So generally it kind of just works. The way it's architected to kind of be this stateless, scalable approach as well means as the user's application scales up, and we're lucky to have users who have been super successful over the last couple of years using Cerbos, and their volumes 10x to 100x over that time, because Cerbos can just scale alongside your application, so it scales kind of horizontally. There's no kind of bottleneck involved, and then Cerbos kind of grows with them. So what we're seeing now is cases of a project that was slated for 3 months to do being done in a week, end to end, to go and implement permissions. And that kind of aligns with my own experience of having to build these systems at previous companies. It was always at least 3 months of a good engineering squad's time to do this kind of properly. And even then we had to rebuild it again 3 months later because the requirements changed so much. So it's all about ultimately helping businesses accelerate getting to their product market fit and getting to their viable product that they can ship. Because there's one less component you have to build. Much like you don't have to build authentication, they're saving time because they haven't got to build authorization, and other stations along that timeline as well, where you just pick these components off the shelf, combine them like Lego blocks, and it allows you and as a business and as an expensive developer team ultimately to really focus on the value add and the actual business value and problem you're solving to your users.
Yeah, sounds like a big relief. And I'm curious to see also what your new Cerbos Cloud dashboard looks like. What are some of the key parts of the product itself? Could you give us a glimpse of Cerbos Cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. So sticking this diagram for now, kind of the one of the areas that we've heard feedback from my users around running and deploying Cerbos is there is a bit of an operational kind of process you have to put in place to kind of manage, deploy, and run Cerbos. So one of those areas is around testing and CI. So we've had a lot of great ambitious users that took Cerbos in the early days and have built these whole CI pipelines around it. As I said, we published tooling to actually run like a GitHub action to test policies if you define tests for them. And then rolling out the changes is where policy updates to your infrastructure is where things kind of could do with a helping hand, which is what we've kind of gone with Cerbos Cloud. So imagine an environment where you've got, say, 5 Cerbos instances running. Those 5 Cerbos instances will be getting their policy from, say, the Git repo or a storage bucket somewhere. And what that means is each of them is polling for updates. So they might each be looking every 5 minutes to go and see if there's an update to the policy. And if you have 5 instances for this, it's going to take up to 5 minutes for all those 5 instances to get updated. And start serving decisions based upon the new updated policies which are being pushed by, say, your product team. So this is one of the early challenges that our users have said, hey, is there a kind of better solution for this? And that is one of the core capabilities that we are starting to release as part of the Cerbos Cloud. It's currently in beta. You can go and sign up at cerbos.dev/cloud. And Cerbos Cloud today is really about optimizing and the rollout and deployment and testing of policies. So I'm going to switch over to one of my demo environments here. Security has logged me out. Good. You need to make sure your security product is secure. And what we have here is...
How new is this, by the way? Are we talking like just launched about a month ago?
Yep. So we announced it at KubeCon in Amsterdam, so KubeCon Europe. Okay. And we've got kind of our first sort of beta customers already up and running in production using Cerbos Cloud today, which is great to see. And we're very early, very open to feedback and sort of work with sort of design partners and how we develop and evolve this further.
The pricing is still being discussed. It's not
it's still being discussed. You can find some examples on our website of how it's going to look. And the capabilities, obviously, this is just the first release, and we have a whole roadmap ahead of us. But really solving this first problem, which is like this: how do you manage and roll out the policies in a scalable manner? So the way Cerbos Cloud works is you set up your environment, you connect it to your existing Git repo. So one of the things we wanted to make sure is we can keep that GitOps workflow, we can keep that ownership of the policies kind of within your business. So you have your own Git repo that contains your Cerbos policies. It could be alongside your application code, or it could be a standalone repo, and you link Cerbos Cloud up to it. So we have a GitHub app, you authenticate out to GitHub, and this connects it all up using that mechanism. So you are in complete control of your Cerbos policies. Cerbos Cloud then operates ultimately as a CI pipeline in this first release. So every time you make a commit to that repo, Cerbos Cloud kicks off a whole process, which compiles, tests, and validates your policies. So you can see I've got some successfully generated ones here. Also, in the case where things might have failed or tests haven't passed, we actually highlight what those issues are, and we give you kind of feedback and links to go and fix it. In the case where everything's been successful, we've run the full test suite, so you define some tests, you can see they've all passed, etc. Cerbos Cloud then produces a what we call a policy bundle. So one of the differences with the open source version is when the open source version pulls down those policies from the store, those policies are still in their native YAML files. So the Cerbos instances, each of them has to pull in those YAML files and then compile them down into the format that is actually used for execution and load them into memory. So there is kind of a small blip on the memory and CPU usage when a Cerbos instance gets an update to policy, and because it has to load and compile on those policies. As part of Cerbos Cloud, as well as running all your tests and giving you feedback around things as they've been updated, Cerbos Cloud also produces a pre-optimized, pre-compiled version of your policies. So the output from Cerbos Cloud is far more efficient when it comes to actually loading into your Cerbos instances, which is important if you're running, say, something like Lambda or as a sidecar where it's cold start times or startup times are important if you're scaling to zero and those sort of things. So it's far more efficient to pull it in. So once a build is complete, Cerbos Cloud then notifies all the connected Cerbos instances inside of your infrastructure that, hey, there's a new version available, here's the update. And this solves that problem of 5 instances each getting their updates within 5 minutes. Cerbos Cloud coordinates that rollout. So all the instances inside your infrastructure will get the update and notified of the update at the same time. And so you have a far more consistent rollout. And so that's kind of the core challenge that we've solved with Cerbos Cloud in its first iteration. The other kind of feature set we put in here is around deployments. So not everyone, it's very unusual to have a single environment inside of your system. You're not just going to necessarily deploy straight to production. You might have staging, you might have local environments, you might have branch-based deployments, those sort of things. So your policies are probably going to vary in each of those environments based upon which environment it is, and maybe you're on like a V2 branch for your next version of your application or your next release, and that has slightly different policies. So Cerbos Cloud allows you to actually create what we call deployment labels. And so you can point Cerbos Cloud to any Git reference inside of your policy repo. It could be a commit, could be a branch, could be a tag. And then Cerbos Cloud, whenever it gets a notified of a commit to a branch or a tag is updated or a specific commit, for example, Cerbos Cloud will generate a policy bundle for each one of those different labels. So you could have your staging environment pointing to the dev branch of your repo, and those Cerbos instances running in staging will get any updates to your dev branch policies. And it's kind of isolated and controlled that way. So you, again, get that nice GitOps style workflow, even at your policy level. And then what that means is when you start up your Cerbos instances, one of the attributes you provide as either an environment variable or configuration flag, etc., is which bundle you want that Cerbos instance to pull down. So you might want your production to pull down latest, you want your staging to pull down the dev bundle, dev label bundle. And then we have examples of how you can spin up in various different environments. We have things like Helm charts, Homebrew, ECS definitions, everything to kind of get you up and running. And that way you can have all these dedicated environments that are working off different versions of your policies as your application demands. There's all sorts of other kind of nice quality of life features in here in terms of feedback. We alert you if there's kind of configuration issues or maybe changes in your policies you need to be aware of. As I said, this is just the first release. It's currently in kind of private beta. If you go and sign up at cerbos.dev/cloud, you'll get on the list, and we'll be inviting more users over the coming weeks. But we have a whole roadmap coming around this that really helps with policy management. It helps with doing authorization checks in browser and a kind of an environment to actually prototype and test policies directly against your repo without necessarily having to run up or spin up anything on your local development environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, looks really cool. I like this feature of labels and just how flexible it makes it, and really simple to operate with. I love labels and tags and those kind of features when they're part of policies, especially. Really makes it scalable.
We've just taken the best things we like from our own experience developing software using various different approaches like GitOps and kind of brought them into the world of security and authorization policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, how does pricing work for this? Any comments on that? Like to understand, like what's the pricing model like? To get an idea.
Yeah, you can find pricing on our website, but the way we're looking at it is it's based upon the number of unique monthly active principals that your Cerbos instances are authorizing. So, you're still running the Cerbos environment, Cerbos instances inside of your environment. So you still get that very kind of low latency lookup, but now those instances are being managed by Cerbos Cloud. And so the way we're kind of looking at monetizing it is based upon ultimately how many principals those instances are going to be authorizing within a month. But like I said, you can find more on our website.
Mm-hmm. Neat. And also from the open source Cerbos to Cerbos Cloud, could you kind of remind us what are the key features that the cloud version offers?
Yeah, so the cloud, it builds on top of the open core. So if you are a developer and an SRE team that's happy to manage policy, set up a CI pipeline, and manage log collection and manage deployments, then you do not need Cerbos Cloud. I'm here to not sell you anything. You should just go and use the open source product. That's really what it's designed for. And all the capabilities that we've been really speaking about when we went through this diagram are a part of the open source project. It's Apache 2 license, off you go. Cerbos Cloud is really about those teams that want a bit more of a structured approach and a managed approach to how policy evolution and policy deployment, testing, and rollout is catered for you in an environment that is very aware of how authorization should be done. So we're baking lots of the best practices into the cloud workflow. And there's capabilities I told you about around pre-optimized bundles, deployment label, different environment deployment labels, and then that synchronized rollout, which is a really big one, or part of the cloud environment. And that we're targeting kind of those teams that want that kind of next level of management capability with Cerbos and Cerbos Cloud. But it's only a one-line config change. So if you want to get going with Cerbos today, you can go ahead and write your policies, store them in your Git repo, deploy Cerbos instances. Then if you decide, yeah, this solution is good for me, it's a one-line config change inside of your Cerbos configuration files to connect it to the cloud environment. You don't need to touch any other implementation you've done. All that will keep working as is. So it's a very simple switch, and we're definitely keen to keep it as easy as possible.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so definitely start with the open source and get a feel for it if you're really interested. Do you see Cerbos, the open source project, at some point, being donated to the CNCF?
CNCF is a great organization. We're a member of it, and we do a lot of work with them. Go and speak at a lot of their events. Cerbos itself makes use of a lot of the CNCF projects as well. So metrics are Prometheus metrics. Cerbos PDPs also have open telemetry headers in place. The logs can be picked up by Loki and all those other kind of great projects in that space. I can't say whether we would donate it, but we're certainly trying to leverage as much as we can kind of the ecosystem and really be a sort of team player and make sure that we're not going to go and reinvent the wheel ourselves to go and build a new metric system when there's Prometheus, and we're not going to go build a whole new tracing support when there's open telemetry. So we're big believers in cloud native, and we build a lot of our systems and architect our systems kind of in that same mindset. And Cerbos is a kind of a drop-in solution that will play nicely with your existing cloud native ecosystem, and that's kind of the way we're approaching it.
Right. All right. So last question I have for you around authorization and Cerbos. So just take a step back and maybe even look ahead to the next year or two. What's coming up for authorization? What excites you the most? What do you think are some of the biggest things to keep an eye on for someone who's working in, who's responsible for authorization? What should they be keeping their eye on? Do you see AI playing some role in authorization, or is there something even more exciting than AI?
Yeah, great question. I don't think we'll ever get a world where ChatGPT is managing authorization, but there's always that bandwagon to jump on. The way I see it, there's kind of two areas that are kind of interesting to me. One is one we've previously spoken about, which is this audit log story and this kind of ability to really understand what actions are happening inside of your system. The importance of having this in place is only accelerating by day, because as businesses get more global, as your user base gets more global, you're going to have to start operating in more jurisdictions, and the data security and data privacy landscape is only going to get more complex as time evolves, as every country wants to adopt new standards and put new regulations in place. So having a flexible authorization system that can adapt to those requirements changes is going to be key. And I think the way solutions like Cerbos approach this, where you have the centralized environment where decisions are made, and having a good audit story is going to be key. It's not the sexiest part of any system when you think about audit logs, but really any business is going to be really pushed on this as you kind of building out systems, or you're getting suppliers on board that to build systems for you. Getting to a world where everything has a very strong audit story is kind of an area where it's going to be, I think, an explosion of really interesting technologies and approaches in businesses to kind of leverage and making sure businesses comply with the kind of the new operating environments as they evolve. Seems like every week at the moment. So that's kind of one area. The second area around kind of where I think things are going to get interesting is around where authorization occurs. So the last 10 years has been about going to cloud, but now we're starting to see the move away from the big centralized cloud environment to applications at edge, or applications even on device, and more distributed, or running at local DCs, and you have these hybrid environments. So being able to do authorization essentially where your user or your application is going to be a challenge. We have some approaches to this. The fact that firstly Cerbos can run anywhere, it's not coupled to any particular cloud environment. We even have a user that ships physical hardware up to the world with Cerbos running on it. Being able to do those authorization checks as close as to the data and close to the user as possible is going to be key. And how about doing things like doing authorization on device, or doing authorization in browser? And just a hint at where we're going with Cerbos, there's the whole wave of WebAssembly and WASM being kind of the next big frontier of computing, and we are looking at numerous ways at how Cerbos can kind of play in that to make sure you're doing authorization at every part of your stack, at every part of your execution environment, regardless of where it is, as cloud, edge, on-prem, on device even.
There's some great thoughts to end our conversation about just being flexible with how authorization is done, and also giving more thought about where your authorization happens, and not just centralizing it in one place and locking it in there. So that brings us to the end of our conversation around authorization and Cerbos. But before you go, Alex, got a couple of questions to get to know you a bit. So I want to find out I want to ask you, what would be your alternate career if not for your job in tech?
So there was a nearest scenario when I had a bit of another career going, which was around being in the media. So when I was a kid, as I said at the start, I was building websites and all sorts of stuff. And one of the things I kind of built very early on as a 10-year-old kid reading Harry Potter books at the time was I built a Harry Potter sort of fan site, which kind of exploded. And so I was age 15, dealing with 3 million visitors a month to this little website. And off the back of that, I got to go to the film sets, I got to go to the premieres, I got to interview the cast and such. So I went from having to be the stereotypical nerd on his computer in his bedroom all the time to suddenly I'm on the red carpet in Leicester Square in London interviewing Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson. So off the back of that, I kind of got into that world of press and media and PR, and I've been to the BAFTAs and done red carpet interviews and those sort of things there as well. So I was on the precipice of kind of maybe venturing down that world, but I really, having some early success with a web platform ultimately, and learning how to scale and build technology that can work at that level, and video editing pipelines and video encoding pipelines, because YouTube wasn't really as big as it was back then. I ended up on more the technology side and started my career at Microsoft, as I said. But I still occasionally harper back to the days where I was at press galas and at the BAFTAs and all sorts of stuff like that.
Oh, that is quite a story. Amazing. Yeah. So the next one I want to ask about is just your role. You're on the founding team now. You say you're working with product, but I want to also dig a little bit more and ask which of the roles that you play in the team do you most resonate with? Would it be something like a product guy or a marketer, a developer, a teacher, or something else?
Yeah, it's a really hard one for me to answer because what I do now is so varied. Like 1 minute I'll be coding, the next I'll be doing this interview, for example. This afternoon I'm interviewing for a new hire. Later this afternoon I'm doing another talk at a virtual conference. So it is quite varied, and I think that's why I was always drawn to this kind of product role, because it is so varied. The one I think I enjoy the most at this moment in time is actually speaking to users who are trying to solve authorization headaches and trying to really map their requirements onto how Cerbos could solve that. So call it dev role, call it sales engineering, something in that space. Ultimately, it's solving a problem that someone's laid down in front of you, using a solution, of which hopefully it'll be Cerbos.
Yeah, sounds like very product centric, and problem solution is on your mind a lot. That's neat. What's one software tool that you think is very elegantly built?
So my current favorite software is something called Obsidian, which you might have heard of. Yeah. So, very early user of Notion for like note taking, even Evernote before that. But the thing I always struggled with those kind of systems is you're locked into their cloud environment. There's no kind of escape hatch easily from Notion or Evernote or those kind of things. It's like you can export as a CSV, but what are you going to do with that? So Obsidian, for those not heard of it, is a fully markdown-based sort of knowledge-based note-taking system. But the key differentiator is the storage behind the scenes is just markdown files. So for me, I keep those in my Apple iCloud drive. So it's across all my different devices. But also you can they're just files on disk, so you can push them into a Git repo. So I have a clone of all my notes in a private Git repo I've got as well. And this kind of like decoupling the storage from the application layer is just something we've also done with Cerbos even. But ensuring that you always have an escape hatch, you always have a migration path in mind should you need to go and move to an environment, and you're not locked into however much Notion wants to charge you a month, the next month they say double it, and you have really no choice because that's where your entire knowledge is. So yeah, Obsidian is one I would go and look at if you're interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've just been through this. I'm still actually through the process of choosing something like that. So I'm right now leaning towards Coda. So yeah,
okay, have a look at Obsidian. There's a very rich plugin ecosystem as well, where people have come from Coda or they've come from Notion, and there's a feature missing because it's open source. They just kind of built a plugin for it and open sourced it, which is really nice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Complete the sentence for us. I can spend hours doing
writing bad code.
Okay.
My day-to-day job isn't writing code anymore, but I still like to tinker and I still do minor stuff. So I could spend hours trying to probably do something that would take an actual day-to-day developer's job 5 minutes, but I like to at least understand how things work, even if I can't necessarily contribute as efficiently as others.
Yeah, well, if you're having fun.
Exactly.
Last question, Alex, is what's your favorite source if you want to find out what's new and happening in tech?
I mean, it's the classic, it's Hacker News. Everyone knows that one. Can you say Twitter anymore, or is it called X? X? I now check X for X tweets. So I don't know.
You said it's coming in a few hours after the announcement, so I think things move really fast there.
I think between those two, obviously you got to be aware of your filter bubble. That's where I get the bulk of my source, and also going to meetups. I go to a lot of conferences and events and meetups, and just the informal chat you have after the talks and such is always fascinating. I'm actually speaking at Cloud Native London next week. If anyone's in London.
Awesome. All right, with that, we come to the end of this episode. It was a pleasure talking to you, Alex, and all the best for just the launch of Cerbos Cloud, and the company around Cerbos sounds really exciting this time. Come back after a few months and tell us what you guys have built when you launch something again.
We'd love to.
Anything new that you add. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed hearing about authorization from Alex at Cerbos. Do get in touch with him. Go and check out Cerbos if you like what you heard just now. And tune in again next week. We'll be talking to another company in the space. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.